Dangerous maritime conditions just hit Greenland harder than anyone expected. Coastal communities are now completely cut off from essential supplies. Ships are stuck in harbors, and the sea ice that people depended on for centuries is behaving in ways that nobody predicted. This isn't just bad weather passing through. Something fundamental has shifted in how Greenland's waters work. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why this crisis reveals a much bigger problem that stretches far beyond the Arctic Circle. Right now, fishing boats that usually bring food and medicine to remote settlements are trapped. Helicopters can't land because of the unpredictable conditions. And the traditional ice roads that indigenous hunters used to cross between islands have become death traps. You might think this is simply winter being harsh, but the truth is far more alarming. The ocean around Greenland is changing so rapidly that even experienced captains with decades of knowledge are making fatal miscalculations. In a moment, you'll see exactly what's causing this chaos and why experts say this is just the beginning. Greenland sits between the North Atlantic and the Arctic Ocean, which means its waters are some of the most treacherous on Earth, even in normal conditions. But what's happening now is anything but normal. The combination of rough seas, destabilizing sea ice, and disrupted coastal transport has created what maritime authorities are calling a perfect storm of danger. Let's break down each element, because understanding how they connect reveals something nobody wants to admit about the Arctic's future. First, the rough seas. Greenland's coastline stretches for more than 44,000 kilometers, most of it fjords cutting deep into the ice sheet. These fjords usually provide some shelter from the open ocean, but recently, storm patterns have intensified in ways that meteorologists didn't predict. Waves that used to peak at around 10 meters are now regularly hitting 15 to 20 meters. Ships designed to handle Arctic conditions are getting battered. In late January, a supply vessel carrying fuel to Upernavik had to turn back after being hit by a rogue wave that damaged its hull. The cargo never arrived. The town ran dangerously low on heating fuel during temperatures that dropped to -30°C. That's the kind of consequence we're talking about. Not abstract climate data, but real people in real danger because the ocean is behaving differently. And here's what makes it worse. The storms aren't just bigger. They're arriving from directions that contradict decades of weather patterns. Traditionally, winter storms came from the southwest, giving coastal communities advance warning and predictable shelter options. Now storms are forming rapidly in the north and east, areas where warm Atlantic water is pushing further into the Arctic than ever recorded. This means less warning time and waves hitting coastlines that have virtually no natural protection. Harbors that were safe for generations are suddenly exposed. And in a moment, you'll discover how this connects to the collapsing sea ice in ways that multiply the danger exponentially. Sea ice around Greenland used to be reliable. Not pleasant, not easy, but reliable. If you were a hunter or a fisherman, you knew when it formed, how thick it would be, and when it was safe to travel across. That knowledge is now obsolete. The ice is forming later, melting earlier, and most critically, it's becoming structurally unstable in the middle of winter when it should be solid. Imagine standing on what looks like thick ice, only to have it fracture beneath you because seawater temperatures a few degrees warmer have weakened it from below. That's happening with increasing frequency. In the Disko Bay area, near Ilulissat, hunters reported that ice they judged to be safe based on visual inspection gave way under snowmobiles. These aren't amateurs making rookie mistakes. These are people whose families have lived on and traveled across Arctic ice for thousands of years. When their traditional knowledge fails, it signals that the environment has crossed into uncharted territory. Scientists monitoring ice cores and thickness found that even when ice appears solid from the surface, hidden layers of slush and brine pockets create weak zones that are impossible to detect without specialized equipment. Nobody's carrying that equipment on a hunting trip. The consequences go beyond individual safety. Entire supply chains depend on seasonal ice roads. Remote villages in eastern and northern Greenland rely on winter ice forming thick enough to support trucks carrying construction materials, medical equipment, and bulk food supplies. When the ice doesn't cooperate, those communities become isolated for months longer than planned. Prices for basic goods skyrocket because everything has to come by helicopter, which costs roughly 10 times more than ice road transport. A bag of flour that costs $5 in Nuuk can hit $50 in a village accessible only by air. People aren't just inconvenienced. They're watching their cost of living spiral beyond what already limited incomes can handle. But the maritime crisis isn't just about ice and storms separately. It's about how they interact. And this is where things get genuinely frightening. When sea ice breaks apart in unstable patterns, it creates what mariners call bergy bits and growlers. These are chunks of ice too small to appear clearly on radar, but large enough to hole a ship's hull. They drift unpredictably with currents and wind, creating what's essentially an invisible minefield for any vessel trying to navigate coastal waters. Traditional shipping routes that avoided major icebergs are now littered with these smaller, harder-to-detect threats. And because storm activity has increased, these ice fragments are being churned and scattered across much wider areas than before. In February, a fishing trawler operating off the southwest coast struck what the crew described as a submerged ice mass that radar never picked up. The impact damaged the propeller and forced an emergency call for rescue. The vessel drifted for 8 hours in rough seas before a Coast Guard helicopter could reach them. All crew survived, but the ship was declared a total loss. Insurance companies are now reclassifying risk levels for Greenlandic waters, which means higher premiums for shipping companies, which means higher costs for goods, which circles back to those remote communities already struggling with isolation and expense. You see how this spiral works. One unstable element triggers another, and the entire system that kept these places functioning starts to break down. Now, let's talk about coastal transport disruption, because this is where the human impact becomes impossible to ignore. Greenland has essentially no road network connecting towns. About 80% of transportation between communities happens by sea or air. When maritime conditions turn dangerous, the sea option vanishes, leaving only expensive and weather-dependent air travel. During prolonged rough sea periods, entire regions can be cut off for weeks. Medical evacuations get delayed. Scheduled supply ships can't dock. Fishermen who depend on getting their catch to processing plants on time watch their income literally rot in their holds because they can't safely cross to market. Consider the town of Tasiilaq on the east coast. It has around 2,000 residents and relies almost entirely on a weekly supply ship from Iceland during the navigation season and from the south during winter. When sea conditions prevent that ship from docking for 3 consecutive weeks, the town faces genuine shortages. Fresh food disappears first. Then fuel stocks dwindle. Municipal authorities have to ration electricity. Schools close because they can't heat the buildings adequately. This isn't a theoretical scenario. It happened last winter, and officials say conditions this year are tracking even worse. The economic damage extends to Greenland's most important industry, fishing. The country exports roughly 90% of its fish and seafood, generating about 90% of its export revenue. When boats can't safely operate, or when they can operate but can't deliver their catch to processing facilities or export hubs, that economic engine stalls. Smaller fishing operations, often family-owned boats that represent someone's entire livelihood, are getting crushed. They can't afford to sit idle waiting for better conditions, but they also can't afford to risk their vessels and crews in the increasingly chaotic seas. Some are going out anyway, taking risks that previous generations would have considered reckless, because the financial pressure leaves no alternative. And inevitably, some don't come back. Here's the part most coverage misses. These dangerous maritime conditions aren't just a Greenland problem. They're a preview of what's coming to Arctic regions globally and even to maritime zones much further south. The mechanisms destabilizing Greenland's waters are driven by larger shifts in ocean circulation and atmospheric patterns. The Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, which includes the Gulf Stream, is showing signs of weakening. That circulation pattern determines weather across the entire North Atlantic and beyond. When it shifts, Storm tracks change, temperature gradients steepen, and previously stable maritime regions become unpredictable. Scientists studying these patterns point out that Greenland is essentially the canary in the coal mine. Because it sits at the intersection of Arctic and Atlantic systems, it experiences the effects of disruption first and most intensely. What happens there will eventually propagate to Iceland, Norway, Scotland, eastern Canada, and down the North American coast. Shipping routes that have been used for centuries will need to be redrawn. Ports will have to upgrade infrastructure to handle different ice and wave conditions. Insurance and rescue services will face costs that nobody's currently budgeting for. The chaos hitting Greenland today is coming to a much wider area tomorrow, and most governments aren't remotely prepared. There's also a geopolitical dimension that makes this crisis more complex. As traditional ice cover retreats and new shipping routes through the Arctic become theoretically possible, nations are jockeying for control and access. But here's the irony. The same conditions that open those routes also make them wildly dangerous and unpredictable. Greenland sits in the middle of proposed shortcuts between Europe and Asia. Denmark, which still holds sovereignty over Greenland, is watching other powers like Russia, China, and the United States increase their Arctic presence. The instability of Greenland's maritime environment isn't just an environmental or economic issue. It's becoming a strategic one, because whoever can operate safely and reliably in these conditions gains significant advantage. And right now, nobody has that figured out. Meanwhile, the people actually living in Greenland are adapting however they can. Indigenous communities are sharing real-time ice condition updates through social media networks, bypassing official channels that are often too slow. Hunters are investing in satellite communication devices so they can call for help if ice gives way, though response times in remote areas can still be measured in days. Towns are stockpiling emergency fuel and food supplies, trying to build buffers against the supply chain disruptions. But storage capacity is limited, and costs are punishing. Some younger Greenlanders are leaving for Denmark or other countries where life is less precarious, which creates its own problems. The population is already small, around 56,000 people spread across an area more than 3 times the size of Texas. Losing skilled workers, teachers, medical personnel, and fishermen accelerates the decline of remote communities, making them even more vulnerable when the next crisis hits. It's a feedback loop where environmental instability drives economic and social instability, which reduces resilience, which makes the next environmental shock even harder to absorb. So what does the future hold? Climate models suggest that the trends driving these dangerous conditions will intensify. Sea ice will continue its decline, not just in extent, but in reliability and structural integrity. Storm systems will likely grow more erratic, as temperature differences between the warming Arctic and cooler temperate zones create stronger atmospheric gradients. Ocean currents will keep shifting in ways that are difficult to predict with precision. In practical terms, this means maritime conditions around Greenland will probably get worse before they stabilize at some new, less predictable normal. Adaptation strategies are being proposed. Some involve better forecasting technology, deploying more weather buoys and satellite monitoring to give ships and communities earlier warnings. Others focus on infrastructure, building all-weather ports with better breakwaters and upgrading vessels to handle rougher conditions. There's talk of expanding air transport capacity to reduce dependence on sea routes. But all of this requires money that Greenland doesn't have, and political will from Denmark and international partners that hasn't fully materialized. Meanwhile, the storms keep coming, the ice keeps failing, and the ships keep getting stuck. The situation also raises uncomfortable questions about the viability of human settlements in the high Arctic. For thousands of years, indigenous peoples thrived in these environments by developing deep knowledge of ice, weather, and ocean patterns. That knowledge allowed them to survive and build cultures in one of Earth's harshest regions. But what happens when the environment changes so fast that accumulated wisdom becomes obsolete? When the ice your ancestors trusted for 50 generations can't be trusted anymore? These aren't abstract philosophical questions. They're immediate practical challenges facing real communities, trying to decide whether to stay or abandon homes their families have occupied for centuries. And here's the final, uncomfortable truth. Everything happening in Greenland right now is a direct result of choices made far away by people who will never set foot on Arctic ice. Greenhouse gas emissions from industrialized nations are driving the warming that's destabilizing these maritime systems. The global economy's demand for cheap energy and goods created the conditions that are now making life precarious for some of the world's smallest and most isolated communities. It's a stark example of how interconnected the planet really is, and how the consequences of collective action don't distribute evenly. The people suffering most from these dangerous maritime conditions contributed least to causing them. That asymmetry should bother anyone paying attention. So by the end of this video, you're seeing Greenland differently, right? It's not just ice and remote beauty. It's a front line where environmental, economic, social, and geopolitical forces are colliding in real time. The dangerous maritime conditions hitting the island are symptoms of much larger disruptions that will reshape how we think about Arctic regions, global shipping, climate adaptation, and the future of communities living in extreme environments. What's happening there matters because it's a preview. And previews, if you're paying attention, tell you what's coming next. If you found this deep dive into Greenland's maritime crisis valuable, consider subscribing for more content that goes beyond headlines and connects the dots between geography, climate, and global systems. Hit the like button if this changed how you think about the Arctic, and drop a comment answering this question. Do you think remote Arctic communities will still be viable in 50 years? Or are we witnessing the beginning of a major population shift? Links to further reading on Arctic maritime conditions and Greenland's adaptation strategies are in the description. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.